The biggest mistake the Israelis could make would be to use a nuclear weapon of any kind. And I've always feared that if they go into southern Lebanon, given the losses that they've sustained against Hamas and the condition of the current Israeli ground force, that they would be inclined to use a tactical nuclear weapon. If they do that, then all bets are off. They well could be subject to nuclear attack. In fact, people are saying quite openly, and I'm talking about people in the foreign offices at the level just below foreign minister. This is the end of the Balfour Declaration. In other words, Israel, as far as we're concerned, is off the table now.
This is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, the former senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. The colonel has been one of the most sought-after voices on both the war in Ukraine and Israel's war in Gaza. This is part 2 of my interview with the colonel, where we specifically focus on the potential of a larger regional war breaking out between Israel and Iran. Earlier this week, a top Hezbollah commander was killed in Lebanon after an IDF drone strike, which was immediately followed by the Israeli Defense Forces releasing aerial footage showing the drone strike that targeted Hussein Ibrahim Kassab. As you'll hear in today's interview, Israel's neighbors are growing impatient with the instability that Israel is bringing to the region. Iran is currently bringing in major military support behind them, including Russia, China, and Turkey. We'll ask the colonel more about these details in today's interview. But ultimately, this conflict in the Middle East puts enormous pressure on the United States. As we've seen over the past 10 months, Netanyahu has proven to the world that he controls an incredible amount of leverage inside the US Congress. The only way that Israel can continue its war, and in reality, survive in the future, is with the support of the US government. But at what cost? Just listen to Professor John Mearsheimer explain the truth.
What's on display these days is manifest evidence that Israel is heavily dependent on the United States. They cannot fight these wars. They cannot continue like this without American support. We have given them $18 billion in 2024. Just think about that. $18 billion.
In today's episode, you're going to learn how Israel's actions has created tremendous instability in the Middle East, learn what Iran is doing to prepare for its revenge, and also discuss the future of Netanyahu and what his extreme control over both the Israeli and US governments means for the future of our world. Now, let's join the colonel in the studio and get started. The big threat right now is certainly a war in the Middle East. We're looking at Israel. We're looking at the potential escalation with Iran. I want to get your thoughts as of today, because we're looking at a potential, nuclear war here. We're looking at the United States certainly getting heavily involved. As we know, the United States is always going to support Israel. And as you had mentioned earlier, that Netanyahu controls, the United States government. I mean, he has an unbelievable amount of reach inside our government and our politics, whether that's Republican or Democrat. But what are your thoughts moving forward with the recent escalations between Iran and Israel, and how do you see this going in the next few weeks and months?
Well, just as Mr. Zelensky is desperate to involve us and NATO in his war, he really wants to bring in the United States Armed Forces in some fashion along with NATO, because it's the only way he knows that he can survive. You have a similar phenomenon with Mr. Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu has known from the very beginning of this crusade to rid Israel of its Arabs through mass expulsion and murder, that the only way to do that is with American help and assistance. He needs American military power to augment his own and protect him. Thus far, he's gotten most of what he wants. But now he's made it very clear he wants to widen the war, and he has provoked the Iranians repeatedly with a goal of precipitating an Iranian attack that he could then point to and say, see, they are the aggressive, dangerous party here. Now we must all work to destroy Iran. And, I think that's what he would like to see happen.
Right.
There are some problems with it. The first problem is that the Russians, over the last several weeks, through successive visits of the foreign minister, the defense minister, the Security Council, and so forth, have fashioned a relationship with Iran that has resulted in the arrival in Iran of large numbers of Russian missiles, Russian electronic warfare gear, Russian radars, including S-400 and even elements of the S-500 air and missile defense systems. It's very clear that the Russians have thousands of people on the ground now in Iran. They have committed themselves to help Iran defend itself. So that's number one. Number two, just this morning, of course, it may have been last night, depending upon your time zone, the Chinese foreign minister called to speak specifically with the Iranian foreign minister and supreme leader and reassure them that China stands with them, that if Iranian sovereignty is at risk, that they will intervene to help. Now, he didn't say intervene, but I mean, the implication is we're not going to let you go under.
Right.
And of course, China has enormous interest in the Straits of Hormuz.
Correct.
You know, if they can't get access to the natural gas and the oil, their production engine effectively seizes up.
Right.
So I think those two developments are things that we should watch carefully. Now, look at the Saudis. The Saudis have now said, no, if the Iranians are going to attack Israel, we're not going to assist Israel. The Egyptians have said the same thing. So have the Jordanians. Right now in Egypt and Jordan, those governments hang by a thread. General Sisi in Egypt, King Abdullah in Jordan are on very, very fragile ground. They are seen, rightly or wrongly, by their populations as Israeli and American puppets.
Oh.
They've got to think carefully about what their next moves are, or they may vanish. And if they vanish quickly, then you will have governments that are absolutely universally hostile 100% to Israel and will cooperate not only with Iran, but also with the Turks.
Right.
To take on and destroy Israel. People say, oh, well, that'll never happen. Well, an awful lot has happened that everyone said would never happen. Right now, we have a relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran that people thought was impossible. The Shia and the Sunni are now cooperating.
Right.
It's sort of like that picture of the Ulster Protestants with the Irish Catholics walking arm in arm down the street because they figured out that the real enemy is not each other, but this foreign alien presence and this globalist government inside Ireland. Mm-hmm. We have a similar feature of reality striking now in the Middle East. People are saying, whatever our differences are, we have a much bigger problem because remember, Israel is also the one state that everybody knows has nuclear weapons and everybody fears will use them. That's the problem. Neither we nor the Russians will deliberately employ the use of a nuclear weapon against each other. We're not going to do it.
Okay.
So both of us have effectively said that.
Okay.
When you go to Iran, which does not have nuclear weapons, but it can get access to them very quickly, has basically said the same thing. The Turks have always had access to a nuclear weapon when they wanted it because of their close relationship with Sunni Pakistan. So the whole area right now is at a slow boil, if you will.
Okay.
The biggest mistake the Israelis could make would be to use a nuclear weapon of any kind.
Right.
And I've always feared that if they go into southern Lebanon, given the losses that they've sustained against Hamas and the condition of the current Israeli ground force, that they would be inclined to use a tactical nuclear weapon. If they do that, then all bets are off. They well could be subject to nuclear attack. Now, I don't think it has to go that way. And you can certainly do enough damage to each other with conventional armaments that you don't need nuclear weapons. But we know the Israelis have them. And they don't hesitate to threaten that use behind closed doors and in back channels. That doesn't seem to have the effect that it once did. The effect has changed. In the past, the various Muslim states would back down immediately, saying, well, that's not what we want. But that's not what's happening now behind closed doors in the Middle East. Everyone has decided that they've had enough of Israel.
Right.
In fact, people are saying quite openly, and I'm talking about people in the foreign offices at the level just below foreign minister, they're saying this is the end of the Balfour Declaration and all the arrangements that have ever been made. In other words, Israel, as far as we're concerned, is off the table now. We're not going to tolerate it.
Right.
So we'll see. But it's not good. And the problem is that we continue to fuel this. We continue to escalate it. And we could stop it. You want to stop the war in Ukraine, it's very easy. You suspend all military aid to this rogue regime. Mm-hmm. I mean, how many billions of dollars have been stolen and are sitting around in Cyprus, Cypriot banks, Albanian banks, Swiss banks, whatever, is anybody's guess. It's just ludicrous nonsense. The notion that we should pour a single solitary dime into that place is absurd. It always was. And worse than that, there's no sense of humanity anymore in the West. You have to look at the plight of the Ukrainian population, about which my suspicion is Zelensky could care less.
Mm.
I mean, we have no idea how many hundreds of thousands of children and women have been trafficked.
Right.
We can't even begin to extrapolate from the war how many people have actually been killed or left the country. Now they're talking about 600,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. And I can remember when I said 500,000 and people said, "Oh, you're crazy. Can't be the case." Now the number is 600,000.
Right.
This is not going to get any better. It can only get worse for the people there. The best thing we can do is suspend aid to the place, military aid, and offer humanitarian assistance.
Correct.
And then ask for some sort of face-to-face discussion with the Russians. Whether or not the Ukrainians are there doesn't matter anymore. This is now an issue that goes beyond Ukraine. It involves Europe and the United States. We should see it that way, and we should come to some sort of strategic arrangement that makes sense for everyone.
Right.
But this government's not going to do it. They're going to let as many people die as is necessary to keep this going through the election. And my concern is, given the choice of personnel that surround President Trump, that could absolutely happen under his administration as well. So not good news. So when will this end? It's not going to end immediately, but I think the potential to end it in Ukraine is there. The potential to negotiate an end for it in the Middle East is very hard.
Right.
I think the potential for a two-state solution is dead.
It doesn't seem a two-state solution has any chance of ever passing. I don't think that's. We know Israel has no interest in that. I think this is obviously Netanyahu is taking his extreme measures. I mean, in his perfect world, I think he would annihilate, every Palestinian. He doesn't have any interest in preserving them or anything. That's exactly what we're seeing. And I want to talk more about Netanyahu specifically, because we see protest, in Israel against Netanyahu. I think there's a lot of pressure. He obviously came to the United States on this big tour, trying to drum up support in Congress, putting an American flag on his shoulders, trying to really, lobby to the people. But I think there's obviously a big movement here in the United States, especially with the youth, being very concerned with the plight of the Palestinians. That was shown in the Olympics, when the Palestinians were coming out on their boat on the opening ceremony. The flag bearer had the shirt on with the bombs being dropped on kids playing soccer. The world is watching, the plight of the Palestinians. And, there's no doubt about it that Netanyahu is, going down the roads of genocide, trying to get rid of these long term. What do you think with his, potential future? Again, from Israel's perspective, they have not really done anything to get these hostages back. I think he has an extreme amount of pressure on him as the leader of Israel. Many Israelis wanting him to resign and get replaced. What is the future for him? Is he going to receive death by 1,000 cuts? Is he on the way out, or is he pretty much solidified and going to be there for as long as he wants?
When Prime Minister Netanyahu was voted into power, and I asked many Israelis about him, one of the principal reasons they voted for him was they were convinced that he was by far the most intelligent man for the job. He had the brains, the political skills, and people generally shared his vision. I don't think they share his vision of what I would call an updated version of Armageddon right now.
Right.
But it's hard to tell. And inside Israel, there are very serious divisions and splits inside the Israeli electorate. But on the whole, they can generally agree with his larger proposition that the Arabs need to get out and that Israel needs to be a Jewish state. Now, I certainly can understand how they feel and why they feel that way. The problem with that approach is killing and expulsion. Is there nothing else that can be done? And of course, at this stage of the game, it's irrelevant. Whatever we suggest could have been done is no longer possible. Too much blood has been spilled.
Okay.
So I think Israel and Netanyahu's fate are inextricably intertwined. I don't think the Israelis can divorce themselves completely from Netanyahu, even if they removed him.
Okay.
I don't think any successor that's out there on the stage, whether it's General Gantz or any of the others, can step in and necessarily chart a fundamentally different course. If anything, they have precipitated, a series of alliances that have to be described as blowback on a strategic level that no one has ever seen before in the region. So I've worried from the very outset when it became clear that, and we got to go back to 7 October, and everyone was horrified and shocked by that.
Correct.
But then as you looked at it, it didn't make any sense because I was there in 2020 in February. I saw the security measures that had been taken and saw the officers that were in command. They were extraordinarily competent, intelligent people. They knew within seconds who shot someone or fired a round or did anything in Gaza. So the notion that they could have been surprised was always something that I found hard to accept.
Correct.
Now we have more and more information suggesting that they weren't surprised necessarily. That what happened was that even the Israeli intelligence cell that was tasked with watching Gaza 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, had warned of something like this coming. And at the same time, you have the deputy chief of intelligence in Israel who called directly to Israel's intelligence leadership and warned them of this imminent attack. There was no effort to move attack helicopters, tanks, equipment, other things into the region to deal with it. And you have this music festival with all these young people in very close proximity to something that everybody knew was dangerous and volatile. Mm-hmm. Was all of this designed to precipitate the conflict that we see now? I think you have to begin to ask that question because certainly there's a limit to what you can do in terms of responding. In other words, what is proportional is always the issue. These were terrible things that happened. What do we do to the people in Gaza? To what extent do we punish them? How do we get to Hamas and so forth? But we went well beyond that within weeks. We were dealing with a campaign on a much larger scale. It was very obvious to everybody. Now this has blown up into a regional campaign to essentially establish Jewish supremacy in the region. I don't think there's much question about that. And that's a very dangerous proposition in an area where you have hundreds of millions of Muslims. The assumption that that is even attainable is dangerous. And you cannot call everyone an animal and then expect them to cooperate with you. It's absurd. I don't know. It doesn't look like something that we in the United States, we Americans who care about Israel, want Israel to survive, think that Israel should survive, can fix.
Yeah, I think it's just, unfortunately, this region of the world has had a troubled history for really since the founding of Israel. I mean, it's been controversial and it's been.
But I think people have to understand that it's not as violent as we think in a regional sense. If you go back and look over the last 300 years, in fact, there's maps that illustrate this, and it looks at the frequency of conflict and violence and war around the world. There's remarkably little there. Right. Huge concentrations in Europe. Right. Huge concentrations in North America because we conquered the continent. Right. Some conflicts elsewhere, but even in Asia, remarkably few. So we've got to be honest with ourselves that Israel has turned out ultimately to be a true catalyst for conflict. And whenever people stood up and said we've got to find a different way forward, Israel has to live within the framework of the region. It has to tolerate and get along with its neighbors. That was rejected. Right. We could have helped that. I think we tried from time to time. Certainly was the case with Nixon, subsequently Carter, and even Clinton. But since then, it's fallen apart. And I don't know that you could put that thing together again. Right. And I don't think there will be any substantive change, even given the result of this election in the United States, come November. I think this war if one of the two main candidates win, I think you're right. I don't think much will change. If you got the third choice, I think there's some potential for change. Right. I don't know how much, because it's a difficult question for us, as you point out. I've always been very supportive of Israel. Right. I think it's has an immense potential to be a very positive force, both in the region and globally. But right now, it doesn't look good. Right. Oh, I agree with you. Well, Colonel, I want to thank you so much for your time and your insights. Always appreciative of that, and we're going to continue monitoring that. So, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. And I'll just leave you with one last word. Tell us a little bit about our country, our choice, and certainly leading up as these next 90 days, coming up to the U.S. presidential election. Well, our membership continues to grow. We're closing in on 500,000 members. Obviously, we had hoped to be further along. I think the elections have actually distracted people. And I think some people are frustrated because we do not publicly endorse any candidate.
Yeah.
We're not telling people how to vote. That's
Good.
not our affair. We're issue oriented.
Mm.
We're trying to unite people across party lines. So if you can agree the border should be secure, if you can agree that we need to restore the rule of law inside the United States and dramatically attack the criminality that is unhinging our society, if you think the drugs and human trafficking and child trafficking that goes back and forth across our borders should stop, then join us. If you think this sort of world of perpetual conflict and war that we've been in since 2001 should end, join us. So we don't say vote for so-and-so or don't vote for so-and-so, but I think we try to get people to look at them, at the various candidates objectively, and try to understand what they're about. And right now, I think, as you pointed out, the differences in many core areas of importance to the American people between the two are not very great, the two that are on either wing of the uniparty.
Right. Yeah, that's something that I definitely agree with. I think 2024 is not going to be the change that we need to see in America, regardless of the election result. But, hopefully if more people can get educated and start looking at those big term issues you're talking about, and, hopefully, looking forward 2028, we can get some better candidates in there and, hopefully some change that happens in the United States. And Colonel, I want to thank you for everything that you do. Thank you again for your insights and your service to the country. And once again, we're going to put all that information down in the links below. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed the second half of my conversation with Colonel Douglas Macgregor. If you haven't seen the first part, the Colonel and I discuss the future of the Ukraine war and focus specifically on why Ukraine invaded the cursed region of Russia. Trust me, this episode is worth your time. Simply click here to watch it. And as always, thank you for spending time with me here on YouTube, and we'll see you all in our next video soon.